Welcome everyone to this webinar titled as Abandoned Asylum Seekers, Temporary Workers and International Students during COVID-19. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which our 4 Australian campuses stand and pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. I am Asylum, Director of the Center of Development Economics and Sustainability at Monash Business School. This webinar is hosted by the CDS. This is a part of our ongoing series, COVID-19 and Beyond, in order to provide a forum for discussion on huge economic and social ramifications of the pandemic and the priorities for the evolving policy responses in both developing and developed countries. Today's webinar is 17th in our series. We started this series in May, and we have been fortunate to have speakers from diverse range of backgrounds discussing on a range of issues, including gender, food security, lives and livelihood debate, inequality, economic and health challenges in different countries, including in parts of the South Asia, East Asia, focusing also on Australia and India. So our next webinar will be on we will focus on the performance and prospects of Chinese economy, particularly Chinese initial response and how China has been able to successfully navigate the this virus crisis. So today's webinar is an important topic for many of us. Personally, to me, I came here as an international student, and I started working after I graduated from Monash, and this is also probably important for many of us who came here either to study or to work. And many of us here are forced to leave their country of origin and want to embrace Australia as their new homeland. But we know that these asylum seekers, temporary workers, or international students have been excluded from the Australian government income support measures provided to many workers in response to COVID. And their problems have worsened because of the lockdowns and restrictions on international travel. So these international students, temporary workers, and asylum seekers are disproportionately affected due to this virus crisis. So our expert panel will present their perspective on health, economic, and ethical issues raised, along with policy options to address in the context of Australia. So we are fortunate to have 3 distinguished speakers, and our moderator today is Dr. Samanthi Gunawardana. Samanthi is a CDS fellow, and she is currently now the senior lecturer in gender and development in the Faculty of Arts. And she is also a member of Monash Gender, Peace and Security Center. She is also course director for the Master of International Development Practice and has a particular interest in labor and employment issues. So after our speakers and discussions, there will be a question and answer session for the audience. So please send your question and answer during the proceedings in the Q&A function in the proceedings. So this webinar will be recorded and you can send your questions in the Q&A functions. Over to you, Samanthina.
Thanks, Asad. I'd also like to acknowledge that I live in and currently working on the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. In particular, as we're talking about exclusionary policy today, I'd like to recognise the past and continuing legacies of exclusionary and discriminatory policy design that continues to impact many First Nations people. I recognise and stand in solidarity with the ongoing struggles of First Nations people in dismantling these structures. As a bit of way of personal history, I was born in Sri Lanka and I migrated here in 1983 as the preschool daughter of an international student myself. And Australia has been the destination for generations of not only international students from Sri Lanka, but also asylum seekers, as Sri Lanka is a conflict-affected country. And some of those asylum seekers have settled here, while others, including their children, continue to be held in mandatory detention. In preparing for this seminar, I actually revisited an article that I read back in April. It first appeared in the Financial Times and it was about the impact of the pandemic and the public health responses that were just beginning to be felt around the world. It was written by the Indian novelist and essayist Arundhati Roy, and she wrote that as India went into lockdown on March 24th with 4 hours notice, the lockdown worked like a chemical experiment that suddenly illuminated hidden things. And this is what, in many respects, the pandemic and policy responses to the pandemic has illuminated in Australia today. What could be more starker than the Prime Minister of this country telling temporary migrants that if they couldn't support themselves because they lost their jobs through no fault of their own, that it was time to go home? Given the overtly exclusionary nature of government spending to help address the impact of COVID-19, we are faced with the illumination of hidden, or at least taken for granted, systems of insecurity that underpin our everyday lives in Australia. We're talking about the people who were left out of key federal government policy responses, such as JobKeeper or Job Seeker payments. These are the people left out of the recent federal budget pronouncement, and these are the people who, as research shows, lost their jobs, didn't have enough money to cover basic living expenses, were skipping meals on a regular basis, were already homeless by August, or anticipated imminent eviction because they couldn't pay their rent. So today we're going to be talking about the experience of people who live in Australia on temporary or precarious visas. We're talking about people who contribute to everyday Australian life and are part of our communities. And if you would prefer to talk in dollars and cents, we're talking about people who contribute to the economy through fees if you're an international student, or their taxes if you're a temporary worker. We're also talking about people who are seeking shelter and the opportunity to seek a better life in Australia. Asylum seekers and refugees held in immigration detention centres or living on bridging visas in the community, whose lives are already shaped by deep structures of precarity, insecurity and uncertainty. Now, Arundhati Roy also noted that the rupture between the past and whatever may come post-pandemic also presents a chance to rethink our world. She wrote that nothing could be worse, in fact, than a return to normalcy, and went on to describe the pandemic as a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And she wrote, to quote, "We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind it. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So how are we in Australia walking through this portal? Today, our guest panelists are going to talk about the immediate and long-term impact of the exclusion of asylum seekers, temporary workers and international students from COVID-19 support measures. Of course, in many cases, individual groups like, I have to say, our own Monash University has stepped in some way to provide some relief through hardship grants and ongoing free food for international students. And we have cases where our students, including those in the master's program that I manage, are arranging free food delivery services for international students. And there have been community drives and donation of food and other essentials to support affected migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. But we really need to understand that the short-sighted responses will have long-term implications to the people themselves, to communities, or Australia as a nation. The panelists today are going to touch on what an effective policy response might also look like, or indeed what we need to do going forward. So what will happen today is that the presenters are going to give some brief presentations addressing the immediate impact of the exclusion from the policy decisions that were taken by the federal government in particular. And we will, after their presentations, which will be presented one after the other, we'll then open the floor to questions and discussions. I'd like to introduce the first speaker. This is Varsha Devi Balakrishnan, who's the National Secretary of the Council of International Students in Australia. Varsha has actually served as a vocal advocate, and she's also a change maker in a diversity of social causes. She's involved in mentoring Indigenous high schoolers, counselling at-risk youth, and championing for the rights of international students. I personally know Varsha because she came through our program, and she's a dedicated and committed social justice activist. Her background is multidisciplinary, and she has a double major in international relations and communications, and she's focusing on gender, peace and security, and currently completing another master's program in counselling. Enormously talented. So welcome, Varsha. I'd like to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Samakti. So yes, I've just actually finished up my tenure as the National Secretary of CISA. I've been an international student studying in Australia at Monash University for over 6 years now. CISA is the National Peak Student Representative Organization for all international students studying at the postgraduate, undergraduate, private college, TAFE, LCOS, and foundation level. We represent over 650,000 international students currently both onshore and offshore. COVID-19, when it hit, has exacerbated the issues that international students have faced in Australia. And when it hit, it became evident that international students were at the bottom of the priority list in terms of help and assistance. And it took strong lobbying for welfare assistance to be offered by some universities and eventually all state and territory governments. We lobbied federal and state and territory governments, advocated to study clusters, reached out to vice chancellors, institution leaders, and other state-based stakeholders for welfare, accommodation, fee assistance, mental health support for students. We wrote to over 180 embassies, high commissions, consulate generals to provide assistance to their students, and collaborated with grassroots level initiative, movement, and campaigns so as to get multidisciplinary support for international students. Aside from allowing students to access their superannuation to date, the federal government hasn't offered support for international students impacted by COVID-19. Most international students are employed on a casual basis and therefore face a higher risk of job insecurity and susceptibility to greater financial impact. They have been on the front line. We have seen student nurses putting themselves out there on the front lines to help Australians, to students restocking shelves and helping Australians and the economy to keep up with the demand in supermarkets. But they are alone and away from their family with little chance to return home given the border closures. And many of them also have been facing a severe decrease in shifts and high job insecurity. Given the unprecedented circumstances, these students are highly distressed. Their savings are about to run out, and they are fearful of not being able to make ends meet. In this aspect, we've seen that the federal government has provided little empathy towards these students, and even more negligible in terms of support. And what's really disheartening is the comments of the Prime Minister asking international students who could not support themselves to go back home if something, and this is something that happened months ago, but it still resonates in the heart of many international students and prospective students that are thinking to come to Australia. Because if the federal government could tell you to go back home, even though you contribute billions of dollars to the economy, it just shows how little they value your contribution to the economy, but also more importantly, bringing multiculturalism and diversity to the community. International students heavily volunteer and spend time in their community, in their suburbs, because that's their home. That's their residence for the next few years that they call Australia their home. And that's how we contribute and grow in our communities. But that was never reflected upon when the welfare aid was rolled out. International students are still heavily left out of job seekers and job keeper scheme. And till date, the only sort of aid we've seen from the Department of Home Affairs is the fee waiver that kicked in shortly, I think it was in August, but a lot of international students that had to renew their visa prior to that have been left out of it completely. DHA is not willing to offer any fee waiver refund for them, even though if they could prove their studies were affected due to COVID-19. And the form itself is flawed in many ways because a lot of international students, though are able to prove that their extension was due to COVID-19, are still getting rejected. So there's a lot of loopholes and gaps in the efforts to help international students, and I say this with quotation marks. Acknowledging the additional funding to research that was announced in the recent budget, the lack of funding towards Australian education providers directly impacts the quality of education and the experience for international students. All the state government level support and institutional level support is being overshadowed by the federal government's lack of support and acknowledgement for the value of international students to Australia. So in the long-term effect, Australia's lack of support and response time in providing welfare support for international students is something that will affect prospective students, and it's something that prospective students are actively taking into account when they choose their study destination overseas. Australia's reputation as the study destination is definitely something that has been hit because of its response to international student support during COVID-19. In terms of policy changes, international students would like to see welfare and financial support from the federal government, and honestly just a general empathy and understanding from the federal government about the value of international students, inclusion of international students in JobKeeper and JobSeeker, greater accountability and transparency around the quality of education given that everything has now transitioned onto the online space, fee reductions for students because they have paid for amenities and campus facilities that they have not been able to access or use. There is no real sort of scrutiny and testing of the online curriculum at this point, and if they are up to standard for what international students have paid for. Students have shared that sometimes they are learning off YouTube videos, and that does not justify the huge amount of tuition fees they've paid. Work integrated learning has been severely affected. Exchange is now not an option, and they have this year, those who have done their final year online, they're questioning whether they are job ready given they have completely been cut off from the sector entirely that they will be now going to work to. There's also a growing group of recent graduates that are caught in between. They're no longer international students, therefore are not able to receive any of the welfare supports because they don't have a valid ECOE, which is required for a student to even try and attempt to receive welfare support. They're unable to get jobs and unable to return home. It's unclear what's being done to support these students that are caught in between. Students would also like to see extension of the 485 visas for students who have paid for their visas but are unable to seek meaningful employment given the current job climate. Because even though they would like, the condition for them to get a PR would be a full year holding a full-time job, the current situation doesn't allow for them to do so. So there needs to be leniency in that space from the government as well. And in terms of community support, more empathy towards international students needs to be done because they have so much ties to the community, and community sentiment is what international students currently rely on to get through their day-to-day hardship because they're cut off from their family and unable to return home. Workplace exploitation is rising because employees are aware that students are struggling to get jobs, and they use the term that students should be appreciative of having a job and therefore should sort of just accept that they are being paid low wages rather than no wages. There's also a growing number of racism and discrimination attacks against international students, and this is something that the community can come together and tackle together because we can raise greater awareness and acceptance that international students are struggling as well and not the cause of the problems that we are currently facing. And I will end off there. Thank you, Samanthi.
Thanks, Varsha. I think the figure is 37.6 billion. That's what international students contributed to the Australian economy in 2019. So a really significant number, and you've raised so many issues, a lot to unpack in question time. I'm going to now hand over to Con. Everyone, a lot of people, I was going to say everyone knows Con, but many of you will know Con. Con Karapan Kanagodias. I'm sorry if I've pronounce that wrong. As someone who's often on the receiving end of apologies, I do profusely apologise, Con, is the CEO and founder of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, the Australia's largest independent human rights organisation that assists thousands of refugees and people seeking asylum in Australia, of course. He is an author of several books. He has won he's been a finalist for the Australian of the Year and the Australian Human Rights Medal. And in 2019, Con was awarded one of the 4 Impact 25 Judges' Choice Awards in the influencer category. He also, of course, holds an OAM. Most recently, in May 2019, Con was awarded an honorary doctorate by La Trobe University and a University of Melbourne Arts Faculty Award for Leadership. Con is going to talk about the experiences of asylum seekers in Australia. Over to you, Con.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And Vasha, thank you for your wonderful talk. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. So what has COVID taught us? Building on what Vasha said, it has taught us an ugly truth about racial inequality in this country. We keep being told by our Prime Minister that we're in this all together, but we aren't if you've got the wrong colour of skin, if you come from the wrong country, if you came in a way that they deem to be the wrong way. Is it of any great surprise when we've had 2 decades of demonising, dehumanising and vilifying refugees, that the toxicity of poisoning the moral imagination, conscience and compassion of this country would spill over into how we then also treat international students and migrant workers? And what it's actually done is expose fault lines, like Samantha talked about before, that have been long-standing. We've always exploited migrant workers. This country is built on that exploitation. We've always treated international students like a cash cow, but without a sense of any moral obligation back to them. And what's been so horrifying during this time was thinking for a moment at least that maybe this pandemic would awaken the moral conscience of our government. That I thought maybe for a moment they wouldn't leave more than 500 refugees in detention centres here in Melbourne and in Brisbane, where they couldn't safely socially distance, where the risk of COVID was extreme, that maybe for a moment they wouldn't leave 100,000 people seeking asylum, 1.2 million temporary visa holders, international students and asylum seekers without a safety net, that they would provide one to them, that they couldn't possibly think that refugees could survive a pandemic with no access to healthcare, income support or a safety net. The themes are so common between the shared exploitation, racism and discrimination you see the asylum seeker community experiencing, international students experiencing and migrant workers experiencing. But there's an extra layer of complexity, which is on top of all the adversity and discrimination and difficulty. We're working with a population who on the one hand is extraordinarily resilient and resourceful, but on the other hand are people who are victims, survivors of torture, of war and displacement. And so it is terrifying to think about how far backwards we are going as a nation, that when it comes to refugees, that we have turned our backs on them as a government. And the budget that just came through, where we cut 5,000 refugee places, 20,000 over 4 years, reducing our contribution to the refugee intake to 0.05% of the world's refugee resettlement, so that we could fund a year of locking refugees up still in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. We cut what little income support there was for people seeking asylum by another 50%. And in fact, the government has budgeted 53 cents per person per day of the asylum seeker community as funding for a safety net during COVID. So we've been talking about how $40 a day is not enough for someone to survive on New Start, the old New Start allowance, and that we can never go back there, and we never can. So $40 versus 53 cents a day. And the whole idea is that people seeking asylum are not meant to survive, and the idea is to break them. So what have we seen at the ASRC? Well, we've kept our doors open, but we've seen people turning up. I had a man who turned up who almost couldn't walk through the door. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. lost count of the number of people that have been sleeping in their cars, families sleeping on the streets, people that hadn't had any food at home. We've had a 400% increase in the number of people we're needing to feed, a 300% increase in the number of people that we're needing to house. And we've kept our doors open when many other charities, unfortunately, for a whole range of very understandable reasons, closed their doors. And we've had to navigate keeping our doors open. We've had to close down once because of COVID itself, but we've kept our doors open through this pandemic because we know people seeking asylum have got almost nowhere else to turn. So the big question is, where is the outrage? We know there are people like us who care, the people that are watching this who care, but how has at a federal level our government been so successful in amputating our rage and us to look at 1.2 million Australians, which is what people seeking asylum, international students and migrant workers are, Australians. If we're in this country and if they're contributing to this country, we have a moral obligation to them or they're paying taxes, regardless of whether they're contributing or not, they're human beings. And so what I would hope to see is an income safety net. What I would hope is for equity, that as COVID doesn't discriminate against you, it doesn't care what your visa is, why aren't people seeking asylum, international students and migrant workers all able to access JobKeeper and JobSeeker? So we're seeing record numbers of people lose their jobs because employers are like, I can't keep you on. And we have seen that our community is the one that is actually going to recover last because they're going to start without a savings base. They're going to start without a pathway back. And they're already in crisis, which is only going to get worse in 2021. Because you can see the government from the international students who said, we'll just go home. But come back when we can monetize you and exploit you and commodify you. And for people seeking asylum, well, we want to starve you to go home. So can we see a theme here, which is this theme around these fault lines, around what it shows around racial inequality in this country? Something First Nations people know only too well. And so our big challenge as a community is, well, are we going to learn anything from this? Because what I fear is we're actually going to go even further backwards, that the government is going to use the cover of COVID to start talking more and more about the right type of people and tougher borders and Australians first. So that's fine. You take out immigrants, you take out refugees, you take out international students, and our economy collapses overnight. So this is a really interesting one about how do we prepare for the fact that they're going to keep trying to divide us? How do we stop having to justify our contribution, our significance, or our worth? And how do we flip it back onto a question about values? That if we live in a country where we have a prime minister that claims to be a man of values and faith, where are those values? Where are those principles? If we are talking about we're all in this together, well, that can be with no qualification. And if we're talking about a human being's life matters, no matter whether they came by sea or by plane, whether they came by seeking asylum or as an international student, then that means we all sit at the table together. We don't, it's not about building higher walls or tougher borders, it's about building longer tables that we can all sit to together. And there's been a lot of silver linings in this year, which has been the incredible spirit of the community mobilizing to help people seeking asylum and international students and migrant workers. But again, why is the charity sector, why are groups that you've been hearing about this afternoon, why are we community groups stepping in having to fill the void of government? Where the hell is their leadership and responsibility? So I think we need to take that passion and that anger and those brutal learnings from this year, and we need to come together as a shared movement, amplifying each other's voices and call, and actually making sure that we are treated as the mainstream issue, that we're talking about Australians here, who all have a right to belong in this country and to be safe and live with dignity in this country. So I think there's a big fight ahead, and more than ever, we need to mobilize, we need to unite, we need to strategize, and we need to amplify and support each other for the long fight ahead. That's my initial thoughts.
Thank you so much, Con. I think that, if that is really a rallying cry that I think verbalizes a lot of what people have been thinking. How do we approach this in a way that we can actually enact broader change and long-lasting change for many? And I think the idea of also, I think what's really powerful is not having to justify our existence. The existence of marginalized groups is also a very important one. I'm going to move on now to our final speaker, Associate Professor Caroline Flier, who is with the Centre for Human Rights Education at Curtin University. Caroline has written extensively and researched extensively on the experience of people seeking asylum in Australia. She's been a regular visitor to some of the sites of immigration detention and also written extensively about the impacts on people seeking asylum of indefinite detention. Caroline has been involved in a range of community groups and human rights campaigns over the past few years, and she's also a board member of the Refugee Council of Australia and continues to liaise with several support organisations and activists to campaign for the rights of people seeking asylum. Thank you, Caroline. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Samantha. I am now going to attempt to share my screen because I have some slides. Thank you so much to Vasha and Con for what you have outlined there on such important issues. And what I want to do, I guess, is to build on some of what they have both said and to focus, though, in particular on another group. And this is a group of people who've been recognised as refugees who first came as asylum seekers, but have only been given temporary protection visas. And it's a lot of my work is with people in this experience, particularly people on a 5-year temporary protection visa, which is so extraordinarily complex that I've got some slides because I want to explain that, because it helps to explain the impacts of COVID on this group. Yeah, I've just sort of, provisionally titled this, if we're all in this together, as Con said, something that the Prime Minister declared at the beginning of this pandemic. If we are all in this together, let's include, of course, people on temporary visas, people who are here as international students, people who are still waiting on bridging visas for their refugee claims to be finalised, and people who have also been recognised as refugees and are living on temporary visas. I'm from the Centre for Human Rights Education at Curtin University, and we have a research and education and advocacy role. And as I said, a lot of my work is working together with people who've come as asylum seekers who are on temporary visas now. I'm also a co-convener of the WA Refugee and People Seeking Asylum Network, which is a collective of people from asylum seeking backgrounds, as well as those of us who are academics, people who work in the refugee support agency sector, churches, activists and others, who all try to be allies and work with people on these visas. But most importantly, before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge, of course, that I'm seated here today on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar peoples here in Western Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the deep hospitality and welcoming that so many have given when they acknowledge and talk, with people with lived experience of seeking asylum and others on this land. I'd also like to acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. Just to give you a little bit of a context, I've just put together here a policy timeline to show, I guess, how people have been impacted by policies for quite a long period of time in Australia. I want to acknowledge my colleague at Murdoch University, Mary-Ann Kenny, who put together some of these slides for a joint presentation we gave, so the creativity is pretty much down to her. But just to show, I guess, a bit of this timeline. So in 2012, 2013 is where many people arrived who are currently only now being given temporary protection visas. So this is people who arrived by boat, came to Australia to seek asylum. Under mandatory detention legislation in Australia, everyone was mandatorily detained, some for a number of months, some for much longer. Now, under the Labor government at that time, when people were released from detention, they were denied the right to work. So most people who arrived at that time, and we're talking in total in Australia now of some 30,000 people. So when most people arrived around that time and were released from detention, they were not allowed to work. There was restrictions on what volunteering they could do as well. And they were forced to rely on 89% of the Centrelink payment. Extraordinary. Now, most people spent at least 2 years in the community before finally they were given the right to work, and could then, with very minimal supports, then had to try and find work themselves, and the majority have managed to do that. In September 2013, there was the election of the Abbott coalition government, who campaigned heavily on stop the boats as a mantra, both before the election and since then as well, and also on a mandate that they would bring in, once again, temporary protection visas and not issue permanent protection visas for those recognised as refugees. In December 2014, the legislation was passed to enable, finally, people's refugee claims to begin to be processed. But this process was going to be changed, and what it's meant is that the provisions of how someone is recognised as a refugee has essentially made it harder for people, to meet that bar. And also this brought in legislation, this legislation brought in the temporary protection visas, a temporary protection visa, a 3-year visa known as a TPV, and a safe haven enterprise visa, which is a 5-year temporary visa. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. The processing commenced the following April. Some 30,000 cases had to be processed. There are many of those that are still yet to be finalised. And also the government brought in a policy where there would be very little funded legal assistance. And so this group were left primarily to figure out how to engage with a refugee claim process, which included 40 pages written in English of an application form, for most of them, without funded legal assistance. And so they were forced to rely on the community sector, community legal centres, many volunteers, many of us who were raising money to try to make sure that there was some supports for as many as possible to engage in that process, which was an incredibly traumatic process for people. And then finally, by October 2017, the government set their deadline for then and said that everyone had to put in their application, which was also incredibly difficult and traumatic for many to meet that deadline. And as I said, the applications processing continues. So, for some reason I can't, there we go. Sorry, bear with me. As I said, I want to focus on the SHEV, the Safe Haven Enterprise Visa, and what that means. Around Australia at the moment, for those who have been recognised as refugees, and there are more than 70% of the visas, of the applications that have been processed, more than 70% of people have been found to be refugees and have been given either a TPV or a SHEV. The majority of people have opted for the SHEV because the Safe Haven Enterprise Visa is a 5-year temporary visa. So obviously that's more attractive than a 3-year visa. The other thing about the SHEV is that there is a slim prospect in that visa that someone may be eligible to apply for something more permanent at the end of it. So there is a slight opportunity to apply for a permanent visa at the end of it. But to do that, to actually be able to do that is extraordinarily difficult, and it spans 2 areas. The first area is what's on the screen there, the pathway. You have to satisfy the so-called SHEV pathway. And that pathway means that for 3.5 out of the 5 years that you're on that visa, you have to either work in a designated regional area and not receive any Centrelink benefits for those 3.5 out of 5 years, although there is some COVID concessions. I'll come to that in a moment. So one is to work in a designated regional area for 3.5 out of 5 years and not receive any Centrelink payments during that time, or study full-time and be physically present when you're studying and not receive any Centrelink payments for the 3.5 out of 5 years' time. Now, the study aspect is incredibly difficult because you are treated as an international student, which means you need to pay international student fees, unless a university offers a scholarship, which a range of universities do. but the numbers of scholarships are small and they certainly don't meet the demand. But you're also not eligible to receive any Australian government funded supports like Austudy. So you have to support yourself. So if you're going to meet the pathway this way, you've got to study full time, somehow work hard enough, unless you get a stipend with your scholarship, to be able to support yourself during that time. As I said, just to return to the top bit, if you do satisfy the pathway by working in a designated regional area for 3.5 out of 5 years and not receive Centrelink payments, what happens during COVID is that if you've lost your job, what do? Now, recently, the government did pass legislation to acknowledge this, which is the first time any concession has been made for people in this situation. So the government at least now recognises that if you've lost your job during COVID, that's through no fault of your own, and that will not detract from the 3.5 years that you're trying to meet if you do happen to be working in a designated regional area. Those designated regional areas are obviously outside of the capital cities, except Adelaide is a regional area, Hobart, Canberra is a regional area, and Darwin. So we have some of the cities, the smaller cities, which are regional areas. Unfortunately, Perth is not deemed to be a regional area, even though it is for a range of other visas at the moment. But of course, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane are not regional areas. Now, a big problem with that is that by the time that people were given SHEV visas, by the time that their claims were processed, many had been living in our communities for 5 years. Many had found work through their own efforts, through efforts of the community and so on, and had started to develop skills and really important experiences, and started to develop really important networks, accessing services that may only be available in metro areas like specialised mental health supports and so on. So it's very difficult for people to walk away from that. And as many SHEV holders in Perth have been telling us that we've been working with for about 3 years, what that means is starting from zero all over again. And that's enormously hard. And there were a number of people we know in Perth who did try to move to regional areas in WA, found it really difficult. It meant that they had to give up their work. They had to go to where there may not be any work. If there was work, it was likely to be seasonal. They weren't able to earn enough. And many who did try to do that ended up returning to Perth. So as the last point in red there says, there are great difficulties in meeting that pathway. But even if the SHEV visa pathway is met, all that you can then select in terms of accessing something permanent is one of a small number of visas that are either permanent, like a permanent skilled visa, or visas that may lead to something permanent. But the criteria of these visas are quite onerous for many, again, to meet. So there is English level, there are English language requirements for most visas. This is a group of people who not only when they first arrived after detention were denied the right to work, they were also denied the right to access funded English language classes. So that means that it was about 5 or so years before they were recognised as a refugee, they could access those classes. So there's another distinct advantage in terms of accessing other visas at the end of the SHEV. So the impact of living on a temporary protection visa, whether a TPV or a SHEV, is pretty clear. It's clear from what anyone on these visas will tell you. It's clear from a growing body of research that prolonged uncertainty and delay has negative impacts on mental health. And no access to family reunion is excruciating. Many people who have arrived on these visas have close family members who are still left in situations of uncertainty or great danger. Many have partners and children who are left in countries such as Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, left in countries such as Iran and so on. And people here, even though they've been recognised as refugees, have no way of getting those people here because of the temporary nature of their visa. And as that quote says, Sorry,
I'm just going to interrupt you to say time is running out for this part.
Yes.
Sorry, do you want to wrap up your final?
I will.
Yeah.
Yes. So that quote there just gives you some idea of the situation pace. So look, and just now with COVID, of course, this group, like other temporary visa holders, are not eligible for JobKeeper or JobSeeker. People are reluctant to accept Centrelink supports if they have lost their job because of the problems with the pathway that it can impede. Now with this legislation I mentioned, there is some capacity to have that taken into consideration, but it also, what has become evident, it's even more difficult to meet the pathway of the eligibility criteria of the other visas as well. So just really to finish off there, I just want to, obviously say and echo what we've already been talking about already, is that we really are all in this together. For people who've been recognised as refugees, now is the time for permanency. And now is the time to get families here. As you said, Samantha, earlier, let us not return to where we were. Let us enable people to settle and to settle here well, which is, of course, everything that they deserve. And this echoes the calls of many refugee-led organisations and everyone on a TPV and SHEV, and we all need to work together to be able to make this happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That was very clear, and we can definitely see then how, people are actually sliding back in terms of any progress they've made in establishing themselves in Australia. Just to reflect globally as well, the United Nations and other large philanthropic associations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have actually shared that they think that the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals and any development achievements that have been made around the world has actually been swept back by about 20 years. And certainly we're probably going to see that in Australia as well for some groups. Other groups have done remarkably well, of course, out of the pandemic as well. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Before that, I'd like to ask the panelists a question that comes from reflecting on the points that each of you have made. All three of you have made the point that the reason that things are so bad is that the system before was terrible anyway. It was corrupt. It was fragmented. There were lots of holes in it. It was unfair in many, many respects. If the system is so bad, it does mean then that addressing the impact of COVID-19 means not just affecting the immediate concerns that we have, but addressing those previous systems that we're now kind of, putting these exclusions on top of. How optimistic are you that we can do this? Where is let me rephrase it a different way. Where do you see opportunities for optimism for broader long-term sustainable change? What can we be optimistic about?
I think there's lots of opportunities. It's a great question. I think there are lots of opportunities. So if we start from the point of view that our Australian government that we have right now is never going to change, well, we need to vote them out. They need to be gone. And I think we need to really think about what does the Australia we want actually look like. In the meantime, knowing we have an Australian government that's actually never going to evolve, it's 10 years of going backwards almost now. We need to be thinking about how do we build and use the social, economic, cultural and community capital that we have. We actually have extraordinary resources. If you mobilize the power of the non-for-profit sector, the corporate sector, the higher education sector, the arts sector, just as a few examples, and you bring us all together and go, well, how do we start building that? We need coalitions. We need to stop thinking and working in silos, even progressive movements. We're missing the opportunity. We're working too much in silos. There's too much duplication. So many organizations are running on a small and only rag. All our best leaders eventually are burning out. That knowledge is then lost and we start all over again. So I think there's a great opportunity to build an intersectional movement, not just between what you see some of what's happening now between asylum seeker communities, international students and migrant workers, but on the broader issues around these broad issues. We don't need a magical system for the people we've been talking about today. They just need what everyone else gets. So if we start from that point of view, the answer is really simple. Just give people access. Give people access to the same economic, social, civil, and political rights as everyone else has. And so then going, well, how do we build an urgency, a pressure, and how do we most importantly win the hearts and minds of Australians? And this is a generational piece of work around how do we actually take what has been decades of misinformation and demonization and shift that narrative and go back to values and go back to aspiration and go back to bringing the groups we're talking about into broader conversations that we need to be facing into as a country around basic universal living income, social housing, more meaningful jobs, action on climate change. All these things are interconnected, aren't we? Around how do we have to end exploitative and insecure work for all Australians. So we need to be embedded into those broader conversations about all of us and just be part of that, not ghettoized, not an add-on, not a bolt-on, but just part of every conversation. And that needs to be led by people with lived experiences, refugees, by international students, by temporary migrants who are speaking for themselves at that table.
Thanks, Con. Basha, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Con has said. And I think for international students, it's just about, don't look at us as dollars and cents, because every time, and this is really funny because when I speak to stakeholders, they ask us to move away from, asking for what's right of us, our basic needs, by putting forth the fact that we're $1 billion industry to Australia. But that same sort of approach is not reflected back on us. Like, we have to state that we are $1 billion industry, so you should give us the basic needs. That shouldn't be the way. It should be about value and a humanistic approach, because whether or not we are citizens of another country, at the point that we're studying in Australia, we do call Australia home. We are residents of Australia. And the fact that we contribute billions of dollars is not what's in our minds all the time, but the fact that we're part of the community is. And if we have that humanistic approach, and it's about equity, if we look at it in that form rather than a corporation, a business, and dollars and cents, I think a lot of things will sort of play itself out, because that is where it comes from. It's the inequality that is stemming from and leading to all these other bigger issues that we face.
Absolutely. Caroline?
Yeah, just to add to what Varsha said, that's funny, I had a meeting this morning with a federal MP, with someone who's on one of these SHEV visas, we're talking about the situation that the person is facing, and that's exactly the advice we got, was to make sure you frame this to the government in an economic way that people are contributing. And, and I can see, this was a very sympathetic MP. I can see where that idea was coming from. But as you said, Varsha, my goodness me, is that really what we have to reduce human beings to? I think this speaks to something that, has been mentioned earlier too. I think maybe Samantha, you were talking about in your introduction. What we really require here is action on multiple levels. And one action is that there needs to be such a reckoning in our country about our history, such a reckoning with the brutal colonialist past, which continues to have such terrible impacts in our country of the First Nations peoples, but also the White Australia policy and the remnants of that, the tentacles of that continues as well. And I think for so many of us, people like myself who are descendant, from some of the first people who came here from Britain, there needs to be a reckoning and an acknowledgement and a deep understanding and a deep listening to people's lived experience, First Nations peoples and more recent arrivals, to understand what it is like to be in our communities. In addition, I think there's also a need for a much greater engagement with the political system. And I think that has to include the coalition. It has to include the coalition, because I think we had this seemingly wonderful moment with the election of the Rudd government after the end of an enormous amount of activism during the Howard government times. And a groundswell within parts of the Liberal Party itself at that time who were opposing some of Howard's excesses. We had a reckoning where we had a time where it seemed like it was possible to have humane asylum seeker policies, for example, in this country. When boat arrivals started to go up again, and the rhetoric of stop the boats emerged, you know, we had the same responses and the same political responses from first Labor and then the coalition. And so while Labor, you know, still talks about that, they argue that permanent visas have to be offered to people recognised as refugees. So they distinguish themselves on that. What we have to do is to continue to work with Labor, but also to engage with the coalition. Somehow we have to engage with the coalition. And I think that there's both a challenge, I guess, and perhaps a call to action for many of us in the sector. And as Con said, and also most importantly, to be doing this, if we don't have lived experience, be doing this with people who do have lived experience and be led by what people with lived experience are saying and their narratives and their understandings and strategies on where to go forward.
I wonder now if we are tapping into what is actually a global phenomenon of thinking about the type of solidarities and coalitions that are needed at this particular historical juncture. We're seeing social movements around the world, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement originating from the US or the climate change movements. We are seeing a lot of coalition building and social justice movements that have emerged with a younger generation of people who are at the helm as well. So we're kind of tapping into both the broader global patterns of inequalities, including racial inequalities, but we're also, I think, encouragingly actually talking I have to point out, we're in a seminar organised through an economics faculty, and we're talking about social movements and change, which is really fantastic. And based on that, I want to go to one of the questions that has been posed by Sophia. Sophia says that she's part of a local working group in the Bayside Youth, Bayside Youth with Refugees and Monash with Refugees, which is a student-led group. She asked, how can we support people seeking asylum in our community and students with lived experience during this time and beyond? Particularly keen to hear from Varsha as you're a student and connected to students or other youth who might need a support, but would love to hear from other panelists too. So how people want to help and they want to know how, what is the best way?
Well, personally, for me, I came to Australia 6 years ago and I jumped right into, I was part of Amnesty Monash, and then I spent my time volunteering for Friends of Refugees. So I was giving back to the Australian community, the refugees and the asylum seekers, even though I'm not a citizen. But it's because of that value that we have in us. And I would like to believe that everyone sort of has that inherent value that you would like to give back and you would like to help others. And that's how I sort of reached out. And students with lived experience, I think it's just it's simple in a sense of sitting down and having a conversation with someone. We're so caught up in social media and posting everything online. I feel like a lot of the conversation is lost. People are speaking to others to just post it online. People are not listening. And I think it comes down to listening to what they need and understanding where they're coming from. And then you would be able to best help them in the way that they need. I think a lot of this help that's being done now is based on assumption that is made at a higher level of what people who are on the ground at the grassroots level need. But there's a disjuncture there because they haven't listened to what actually is the support that students need, the refugees need, and asylum seekers need. And it's sort of I as an international student, and I've had this conversation with a lot of my peers, we say that we're here fighting for our rights in Australia. And then we look at the refugee and the asylum seekers communities fighting for their rights, and they're here way before we got here because we came here like 5 years ago or 2 years ago. And then the harsh reality is we see the First Nation people who are still fighting for their rights. So we're questioning how much can we do, how much noise can we actually make to get our basic rights when the First Nation people, they're still trying to get their rights and their voices to be heard. So there's a systemic problem of stifling down voices rather than empowering them to speak up and to be heard. And I think that needs to change.
Would anyone like to add anything else to that comment? Brilliant, Vash.
I think it's just volunteer. Just add to that, practically get involved. There are lots of wonderful charities helping people seeking asylum, refugees, international students. Volunteer. There's a simple Google search and you'll find lots of terrific places, from the ASSC to a whole range of other wonderful organizations, Refugee Council, so many wonderful international student groups. Get involved. We're all going to be needing you. And as we all prepare for the new year, I know our organization shortly is about to go on a massive volunteer drive, because we're going to need so many extra hands in 2021 just to be there on the ground, responding and standing with refugees. So roll up your sleeves and get involved. That's the best thing you can do.
Thank you. Caroline, did you want to add something to that as well? I saw you unmute yourself before.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, I just want to echo all of that, but I also want to say, go and talk to your MP. Go and talk to them and raise your concerns and let them hear, because they don't hear enough from us.
Absolutely. I'm just reminded, actually, you know, someone who's been doing, one of the questions that kept reoccurring in my mind through all of your presentations and in the discussion right now is, who is listening? Who is listening, right? How can we be heard is one question, but who is actually listening to us? And just to connect that to your point, Caroline, you know, I'm struck by the exercise that Jackie Lambie undertook. I don't always agree, you know, with her points, but she has been listening. She's been seeking input, and if only if all our ministers actually did that kind of exercise, but you can still force them to listen to you. So definitely we need that change at the policy level. I have another fantastic question from Eleanor in the chat, and she asks, what role does the media and big business have in sustaining attitudes towards asylum, international students and migrant workers? And if significant, how can they be mobilised to support efforts for change? And thank you for a brilliant panel. Thanks, Eleanor. Who'd like to address the role of the media and big business in sustaining attitudes?
I'm happy to say a few words to start off with. I mean, I think the mainstream media has a significant role to play, and unfortunately, the mainstream media often relays uncritically the words of senior MPs. You know, that is often deemed to be what is newsworthy, and there is not always a critique of that. There are certainly really good elements of the mainstream media and some fabulous journalists who do great work. But I think as a whole, the mainstream media have a huge role to play. Having said that, of course, social media is a whole other area that can enable voices to be heard that are not being relayed through the mainstream media, but also other voices who you do not want to hear are also enabled through that. But I think there is a real nexus between what senior MPs say and what is, you know, put on, you know, the news headlines, print, online, as well as on TV, radio, and that is a significant concern. And to try to, you know, pierce that is really difficult work. And I think there's a real challenge with that work. But then I think the role of big business is really important too, because, you know, who else is, you know, going to be heard? It's often big business. And who are the government going to listen to? Certainly big business, and finding, I guess, key allies in those areas and really asking people to step up in those areas is important as well.
Just building on that, look, I think one of the key things, this goes back to how do we change conversations and to change policies? We know we could never imagine, for example, marriage equality being overturned again in this country. And this goes to the point that Caroline was talking about before around we might get an ALP government back in who's promising a more progressive agenda, but how long before they flip back again? So clearly the reason why marriage equality won't shift is now it's built into our DNA as a country that we have to be equitable and just to LGBTIQA people. But how do we get there when it comes to refugees as a nation that's Indigenous and multicultural? That's its entire history. And that's where we're going to go back to a point before that Varsha talked about, which is about if we're going to shift media, if we're going to shift government, if we're going to shift big business, it all comes down to values. Because if we argue the economics, we're sending the message, oh, there's an economic price point where torturing people or harming people is not acceptable, and there's a price point where it is. If we're talking too much about contribution, well, if they're the exceptional refugee or migrant, we'll let them stay. But if they're not, we'll treat them really cruelly. And we must go back to values. And so often how I deal with media is not using racist, misinformed tropes around, oh, so we need to stop the boats, don't we? And I'm going, do you mean human beings? And do you mean people forced to flee their country and seek asylum by sea because our government refuses to provide safe passage? Do you mean our government that actually forces people to sea? Oh, but we need to lock people up to be tough, don't we? So I asked journalists, so how do you feel about child abuse? Are you a fan of that? Do you support that? And they're horrified at me. And I'm going, well, that's what that policy is, locking up those children from Bilawela on Christmas Island. That's child abuse. So are you in favor of that? Oh, no, of course not. Okay, well, let's have a conversation then around what's going on here. And what I'm finding is, don't be dogmatic. Don't try to win the conversation. Recognize that people are coming from a place of fear that has been saturated through mainstream media and most of our politicians for decades now. And let's start unpacking that fear. And let's start finding a common ground. Like I often do with my uncles. I have a lot of racist relatives where they'll sit there and they'll be like, oh, but we came the right way as Greek immigrants. I'm like, but when you came, did anyone want you? Oh no, they spat on us. They beat us up. They told us to F off back to our own country. Okay, and how did that make you feel? And are you proud of what you've done now? I'm so proud of what I've done. Well, these refugees I work with, uncle, they're the same people. It's just timing. So how do we go back to a common ground about us? And how do we talk about values? Because then people have to at least own those values. Actually, I'm not a compassionate person. Or actually, I am. Actually, I care about everyone, or I don't. Principles and values are something you give to everyone, not to yourself. And so that's what we've got to lead with, our values and our principles, and find a common ground to bring people with us instead of this sort of division and dogma that's just pushing people into more and more polar spaces.
I agree with what Con said. So I've had to deal a lot with the media calling for comments and, asking for interviews. And it came to a point where I had a lot of international students actually contacting us and saying, I'm actually getting scared looking at the news, So then we had to sort of have a strategy as to how do we tell international students to manage what they read on the news? And it sort of became fear-mongering for them, where when they open up the news, they're worried, am I going to be kicked out tomorrow? Is Australia going to, ask me to leave? And that's a big problem for international students. And I assume for the wider community as well, because the media wants readership. At the end of the day, it's about views, it's about readership, and it's about money making for them. So the more sort of commotion they can stir up, the more emotions they can rile up, the better for them, but the worse for us. So there needs to be a rethinking about what the media is actually doing, because we get calls for comments on, okay, so the Prime Minister said this, can you find me a specific student facing this specific situation so I can interview them and put it up online? But zero regard is given for that student and what they're going through and their mental health. No, we just want the story to go online. So that's where we had to look at what's going on, and we cut out a lot of interviews because we needed to protect the students. And even though some of them say, oh, you get to be on TV or you get your name out there, and that's how they entice them, but they don't realize that they're doing detriment to that student and to the international student community when they put out such articles. So I think coming back to the fact that they need to be empathetic and humanistic in the way they approach things, and that's how the system will change, because when we read the news, our attitudes sort of get adjusted. The more we read about such news, the more we get adjusted to seeing things a certain way. So if there's a recalibrating of that, then people get recalibrated.
Just reflecting on what you've all said, and movement building and the imperative that we have to build social movements that are cohesive and inclusive, do we need an education system that promotes teaching about, empathy? Do we need empathy and also social movement building? What do you think about that? I'm reflecting on my role as an educator here and thinking, geez, it would be great to have you guys come in and teach our students how to change the world, essentially, which is actually what we talk about a lot in development practice. But how does change happen? I think the reason that we get the questions that we get in these types of forums is because today people are really stuck and they don't understand how we can make change happen in a society that has lived through several decades now of individualizing social policies. Sounds like I'm leading a revolution here, Assad. But, you know, is that what we need? I don't know.
I say yes, definitely, because so I've recently joined the Club of Rome we did a global youth summit recently, and one of the outcomes of that summit was we had an intergenerational dialogue with the Club of Rome members. So we were young people speaking about what we want to see in terms of change, climate change, rethinking finance, the economy, and all of that, to the older generation, because they were the ones in the position to make change happen, but we're the ones who can think out of the box to see the change that we want to see happen. So I think the intergenerational dialogue, which is what we sort of have here as well, me being the young person, but that helps heaps, because we're the people who know how to use social media to start a social movement. And we've seen that happen, and we've seen the change that young people can bring about. But we don't want to be seen as the people who are always revolting and, you know, stirring up the pot, because sometimes we need to do that. And it can happen in a dialogue, in a civilized manner, rather than us going out and protesting. So having that dialogue happen, I think everyone does have empathy inside them, but systemically, it was very interesting. We had this conversation where when I speak to my grandmother, she's about every dollar and cent that we save, because that's how she grew up, you know, that's how she raised her family. And while she might not agree with how I see things now, there is a common ground that we can find. And that's how things need to go. Finding that common ground will be the way forward.
I totally agree. And I think a lot of what you're saying, Varsha, is about building relationships and building community, isn't it? And so many of the social movements that are iconic and that have brought about real change, throughout history, have built those communities and have sustained themselves somehow over the long term, because bringing about significant social, political, cultural change, is as First Nations people know so well, takes a long time, but it's so important to have that list, those opportunities to be together, and social movement is such an enabler. But I think coupled with an emphasis on building community is really important as well.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so Con, do you want to say any last words before I sum up?
I just think, just building on the eloquent words of both Varsha and Caroline, I can't stress the importance when I work with young people of just teaching empathy. Teaching humility, compassion, perspective, and resilience. Nurturing resilience and empathy and kindness. That's what changes the world, because if you start with those emotional building blocks and you nurture that resilience, anything is possible from there. That's where we have to start.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Varsha, Caroline, and Con, for your amazing contributions. I just want to end, before I hand over to Assad, to say, I started the discussion with a quote from Arundhati Roy, where she asked us, can we walk through the world with little luggage, ready to imagine another world? And from what I'm hearing from all of you, and especially from our youth, like Varsha, is that we can. There is another world that's possible. So that's really wonderful to hear, that there are things that we can work towards that can help change the current situation. Assad, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Samanthi. Thank you, our speakers, Varsha, Caroline, and Con. It was a great discussion, and we have learned a lot of issues that are evolving due to this pandemic for this particular group of people. I hope we get something out of it, and I hope what issues we have raised, the government and the other agencies here, from us and from people. And with this note, I would like to thank you all on behalf of the CDS. Hope you have a good time, stay well and stay safe. Thank you.